Welcome to 22 at the Lips. I'm your podcast host, Alexis Hardwick. And if you're new to this journey, if it is your first time listening, thank you for being here. This is a podcast host from EMS providers to EMS providers and healthcare providers and anybody and everybody in between. Whether you work in the ambulance, you work in a hospital setting, or you are just driving in your car right now or sitting in your living room drinking coffee and you have no clue what any of this is, thank you for being here. So on the podcast, obviously, I have super cool guests, but I try to find throughout my career, throughout reaching out to people, whatnot, and just existing in the realm of this field, I find these people who have done incredible things and have just things that are not necessarily just you put on a uniform at home, get to shift, you work on an ambulance, and then you go home. But today is one of those exceptions of things that you hear about, things that maybe you've thought about and you have questions about. Our guest today is Mr. Kevin Grange. If you don't know who he is, he's going to go a little blurb about himself, but he has written Lights and Sirens, which is a really good book. I found it at the perfect time of when I was kind of in the cusp of like, do I want to go into paramedic school? I don't know if I'm made for it. I don't know if I'm going to do this forever and ever. And then I read Lights and Sirens, and very, very eye-opening about like what paramedic school entails. What does it mean? And in the cusp of that, also the internship and FTO process. And what does that look like whenever you're on an ambulance and you're trying to play paramedic with other skilled providers, and especially Mr. Grange, the system you were in, very, what's the word? Not critical in a bad way, but like, we're talking like top tier shape and structure of a program, but FTO providers, but we'll get to that. He's also written, and if you're not watching, I'm holding up the book. It's called Wild Rescues. And I know you've written other things, my guy, but this one is my favorite. I had this book because anytime that I meet somebody that's like, oh, I'm thinking about search and rescue, I'm like, hey, let me tell you about this book real quick. Really good stuff. He has worked in national parks such as, and if you read Wild Rescues, you'll learn about it, Yellowstone, Yosemite, and the Grand Tetons, which, side note, I didn't know what that actually meant until he explained it in the book. And I put it down. I said, oh, anyways, he's done a lot of really, really cool things, and had him on today to talk about that and his experience. If you are interested in getting in on any of this, what to do, his tips, tricks, advice, all that good stuff. But before we get into that, Mr. Kevin Grange, if you want to tell the people who you are, what you stand for, what's your story, my guy, the floor is yours.
Well, thanks. Yeah, thanks so much for having me on the show. Super honored and thrilled to be here. And that was quite the intro, so I don't know how I can top that. But yes, I am currently a firefighter, paramedic, and engineer with Jackson Hole Fire EMS. And, I do the writing on the side, which is part, it's fun for me, but it's also sort of like therapeutic in a way, writing about these calls and whatnot. But yeah, I grew up in New Hampshire and then went to college, lived in California for a while where I attended UCLA's paramedic school, and then had the idea to write the book about Lights and Sirens just because people know what we do, but they don't know how we do it. So I really wanted to just like share the profession with readers and the general public. So I wrote that book, and then we were talking about interfacility transports prior to the show. And so after UCLA, I was having a real hard time getting hired by a fire department. So I did work for an IFT company in the Compton area. And, it was sort of like my lowest time in medicine, but also like my greatest time in medicine, just because I was working with awesome people who, like me, all had a dream of taking it to the next level, working for a fire department or a different EMS agency. And all the cards are stacked against you. Like the nurse never has a good handoff report. And you got to really just learn to do a good assessment. So I did that for a while, and then got hired with the National Park Service at Yellowstone, and then jumped over to Yosemite, and then back to Yellowstone, then over to Grand Teton and then got hired with Jackson Hole Fire EMS. So that's what I'm doing. And my wife is also a firefighter paramedic. So we're currently on the same shift. So that's fun to work with her. And the new thing with me is I have a book coming out about grizzly bears, which is sort of a genre switch, but I've always loved grizzly bears and they're out here, in the Tetons and Yellowstone. So I'm excited about that as well.
I think bears are cute and cuddly, and this is going to sound dumb. I watched that Cocaine Bear movie. I mean, I know that's so wildly I'll never see that in my lifetime, but ever since then, man, bears scare me. I don't, I'm good. Especially the one scene with the ambulance. I'm good.
Sure. Yeah, I think that movie falls into the category of it's so bad it's actually good. It's like it's so bad, but it's actually good, But yeah, most bears, obviously aren't out to get you, and they just kind of want to be left alone to do their thing. But yeah, it's great to live out here, and I'm not currently with the Park Service, but we do mutual aid with them and interface and train with them. So it's good to be still connected to the Park Service, even though I'm still full-time with Jackson Hole Fire EMS.
Absolutely. So a couple of quick rapid fire questions, a little get to know you. Obviously, you're a very outdoorsy man. Before we started recording, Mr. Kevin Grange, I don't think I'll ever say this. He was like, I might be running a 30K. I don't know. Okay. Very outdoorsy and active man. I am not. But Mr. Kevin Grange, first question. What is your favorite season?
I think summer, here in the Tetons, you can trail run, mountain bike, you can fly fish on the river, you can go whitewater rafting, you can hike and camp and backpack. So the summer here in the Tetons is, it's 90 today and tomorrow, but generally it's around 70 to 80 and sunny and no humidity. So it's pretty sweet. So I'd have to say summer. How about you?
Summer in any other state besides the South.
Right. Sure.
I'm a huge winter fan just because I like the cold. I like looking at outside, but I like being on the inside because it's too hot. I don't like sweating. I've done enough of it in my life.
There you go.
And hot chocolate.
Nice. So. Yeah. Hot chocolate's great. Maybe with a shot of Bailey's.
Don't tease me with a good time. Next question. What is, if you're going to go, let's say on a hike or spend a couple of days in the great outdoors in the woods, what would you say is the best survival tool?
At this point, I'd have to say an inReach, the kind of GPS system. Because I think if you get into trouble, you're able to get help. And, Apple phone just announced with their forthcoming upgrade, you're going to be able to have GPS capability on your phone. So if you need to call that search and rescue team for help or send a text to your family, let them know where you are, that you're doing okay. So probably that, and I guess we were watching the show Alone at the fire station the other night. And I think everything else you can kind of improvise, getting water and, using whatever else you need out there to survive until help arrives. So I'd say an inReach device.
Correct. All right. I can get behind that. Yeah. I was low key kind of expecting you to say something like a tourniquet or something like that. But
oh yeah.
If you're lost and no one can find you, I don't think yeah, that makes sense.
Well, I guess having worked in some wilderness medicine areas, you learn to improvise. I think that's like your number one skill. So when you mentioned tourniquet, I was already thinking my belt that I'm wearing right now. And, clothing could become gauze of sorts. And,
True.
Like a sleeping pad that you're camping on could be a splint. And, so you kind of learn to improvise and just
fair.
Make it work.
That's fair. I hope to never be in a situation where I have to improvise, because if I don't have somebody that's skilled and / or knows where we're going and where we're at, I ain't going.
Sure.
I've got 2 dogs to get home to. Like I can't, I can't be
Right.
getting lost.
Yeah, exactly.
Last question. If you were going to have dinner with one person, dead or alive, who would it be and why?
Let's see. Dead or I don't know. I mean, I grew up playing basketball, so I think maybe like Michael Jordan or Kobe Bryant or someone like them. But then once you start thinking, it would be fun to. There's a bunch of people I'd like to meet, but probably one of those guys, or maybe Tom Brady. I'm from New Hampshire, so I'm a New England fan. But
Checks. Okay.
yeah, generally, I guess I love like the underdog story, and I love like Tom Brady was picked sixth round in the draft, and I kind of relate to that just because as we talk about paramedic school, I started school when I was in my like mid 30s, and I was super old, and so I guess I've always felt like a little bit of an underdog in the career because I started it later. But I do get a lot of emails from folks that say, it's awesome that you went after your dream, and I'm a similar age. And, so I kind of wanted to show that side of the profession too, because a lot of people these days are finding it a little bit later, in their late 20s, early 30s, even 40s in some cases.
From someone who is about to turn 29, mid 30s is not that older, my guy.
Right.
Let's take it back on that one. Stop, please. My body already
No, you're
feels
good.
aged. All right. Speaking of finding this field later on. So Lights and Sirens, you wrote it about your experience in applying and going to paramedic school, and not so much of, I'm going to be honest, when I started reading the book, I was like, okay, I'm going to learn about different calls, read stories, experiences, but it's a lot more on the educational side, which I appreciated because again, before you start paramedic school, even if you talk to people that I would say even with EMT school, but especially paramedic school, you can talk to people that kind of look through textbooks and stuff, but when you're actually like in school and you're learning for yourself with the added pressure of not only, hey, you're going to have an exam, and if you don't pass, sorry. Not only that, but also the continual pressure of, if you don't learn this, when you get in the field, you're going to be by yourself. And if you don't know it, who's really to blame when the patient declines? That hurts my heart every time. But so it's a lot of that, but also what I really appreciate was you talked about in your FTO and your internship and whatnot, actually getting on the ambulance, and like it's a tangible fear that you can read about, and when you experience it, it hurts. That fear of, not only am I with these skilled providers who obviously have proven themselves time over and time over, but also I have to like play pretend and start training myself to be able to think not just what to do in the situation, but also those next 3 steps ahead of, because I do this, or because we need to do this, or prioritize this intervention over this one. Like, what is that going to look like in about 5 minutes? And how is that going to affect the patient? And what I really loved was you went from your very first call where you just rushed in, and even just the little nuances of like, stop and listen to the providers that were already there, give report, and then treat your patient, and then do this, or simultaneously, depending on the situation. Anyways, but you went from like the almost stark difference of when you first started to the very one of your last ones where you're like, okay, I've got this, and then it goes beautifully. And I really appreciate like that night and day kind of difference, because even as you're going through school, you never really grasp like that, okay, I'm getting better, until your FTO or someone else tells you like, hey, you're really improving in this area. So I can appreciate that, because it was always this constant, like after every call, it doesn't even matter if it's BLS or not, I was constantly just, hey, what can I do better? Hey, where can I improve? So it's a lot of that. But what would you say was, if you had to look back, if you had to think back, what was one of like the most, I guess, crucial moments or experiences from paramedic school? Like, what is something that if you could go and tell people, like, hey, this is what you need to focus on, this is what you need to do, this is going to help you, what would be that thing for you?
Well, I guess a couple things. Like one thing you mentioned is, I've precepted some students now. Is like you're the ideal student because you're asking questions and you're teachable. So like I've had students where, I kind of say like the energy you put into it, I'll match your energy with my energy. So if they want to learn, I'll give them everything I can. I'll work extra with them, train with them. But then some students feel like they know it all, and in this job you can never know it all, and that just breeds complacency. So I love that you had that mindset of just, hey, what can I do, what can I learn better? So I tried to carry that. And then I think the hard part with internship is you're not just getting advice from your preceptors who are probably going on vacation, and you get a new preceptor, and then you're getting advice from everyone, the captain, the firefighters. So you're just inundated with all this information, and everyone runs a call a little bit differently. So I guess learning, which takes, a few years following school, just learning what to keep and what to let go of and what's your specific way of working. So that's all just like a good learning process. And I think one of the things I've learned is lately I've been talking at lectures and whatnot about like the momentum of a call. And it's like calls, we come in, we got momentum. And so like when the momentum on a call seems to stop, I have this like internal awareness of, okay, we need to try a different tactic or try a different intervention or try a different, way of speaking to the patient to convince them to go, so I don't know. It's just like, it being a provider, it's just keeping that momentum and the flow going. So that just takes time, I guess.
Right. And it takes time. One little thing. It's also whenever you get hired on at a new agency, it's a matter of you're proving that like you have the competency to work there. You're proving you have the competency of skills, techniques, protocols, this, that, and the other. But also you're proving that like you're going to be an asset to that company. So it's so many areas you're getting hit under, like you are under a microscope 24/7. And hopefully you're somewhere where you have leadership and people that are supporting you. But it is still very much you are under a microscope, and it can be for every little thing. But that momentum of the call, it took me a while to kind of go from like when we walk in, I immediately like want to be hands-on. I immediately want to be touching this. I want to start doing this. And I'm like, hey, what's going on today? As I'm putting on a blood pressure. Like,
sure.
Whew. But also that it's that period of time where you have to learn not just you're sick or not sick from the doorway, but also gathering all of the history, gathering all of the, this hasn't been since last night. This started 2 hours ago, but this other problem started like right after this one. And what does that mean, grand scheme? On top of having to learn like what somebody told me one time, and it's perfect. I used it yesterday and it made all the difference in the world. Going from necessarily not just don't stand there, do something, to don't do something, stand there. And just like that, going from like, you want to look busy, you want to continually be doing something, but also taking a step back to just assess the entirety of the situation or whatever the call is. On top of knowing immediately like what warrants you actually just like picking up and loading and going versus, hey, we can stay and play. Yesterday was very much one of those moments of like, should we stay and play on this, or can I do this on the way? Meemaw with a heart rate of, heart rate of 31, 0 radials, systolic of 83. Oh man.
Wow. How did that turn out?
After, I don't know how she is now. I hope she's great. She's also 96, so I'm just gonna
sure
put a pin in that. But by the time we got to the hospital, after a little bit of fluids, a little bit of Trendelenburg, and a milligram of atropine, her
Nice.
last pulse that I palpated on her carotids, and she ended up getting brachials, not radials. Couldn't help that one. Sorry, Mom. I think it was a rate of 61, and last blood pressure was like 109 systolic.
Nice.
So very much did what I could with what I had.
Sure.
There you
No,
go.
you did well. And I guess one last thing on my preceptors and momentum and all was one of my preceptors was kind of this laid back surfer dude. So he taught me to like be grounded on a call. And then the other preceptor was kind of high strung and a lot of energy. And he really taught me to like speed up the call. And so some calls you get there and things got to happen fast and get moving, load and go, like you say. So one of my preceptors taught me that energy, but then other calls, like everyone's freaking out. Like I can just talk about this call we had this week where this guy like cut his lower leg with an axe, and like, they had a tourniquet way up on the thigh when it should have been below the knee because the cut was near his ankle. And then so everyone was already amped up. So in that case, the momentum of the call had to actually slow down a little bit. And it's like, okay, this tourniquet's placed in the wrong area. And then does he even need a tourniquet? And it turned out he didn't need a tourniquet. So we converted it to a pressure dressing. So momentum can go both ways. Like some of these calls where everyone's full of anxiety and freaking out. Sometimes you got to slow the momentum. Like you say, just don't do something. Just everyone stand there and take a breath.
Yeah.
So yeah.
I had a medic tell me one time while I was in P school, he said, during anything, you always have 3 to 5 seconds to take a breath and reevaluate. And it's genius. And it's so crucial for me and my partner, because like you said, once I've gotten better, I'm not going to say I'm perfect. Nobody's perfect, but like once everybody starts getting amped up, you kind of just feed on that energy, because you're also thinking of everything of like, what hospital's the closest, what hospital has these capabilities, how fast can we get there, do we need to fly this way, do we need to, all of that starts ramping you up. And so my partner has this very beautiful thing, and I'm going to bring it with me for the rest of my existence, especially I don't work today or tomorrow or Sunday, so I'm going to say it, in a cardiac arrest, where if we're in the cusp of all of the things that need to be done in 5 minutes, and then we stand there and just push a medication and hope for the best. During the cusp of all that, she'll look at me whenever she sees that like the gears are whirring, but no words are coming out, and I'm just standing there trying to figure out what's next, where we're at and that kind of stuff. She'll look at me and she'll be like, Alexis, where are we? And it's that very grounding moment. And I think it's so crucial to, like you talked about, go from like the hey, everybody's wrapped up, everybody's amped up, we're gonna miss something, we're gonna completely fly over. And then if you have like 50 people on one scene, somebody's gonna think somebody else is doing something, and it's not gonna get done. It's just forever gone. So very much that like, hey, let's take a breath, let's slow down, everything's good or not, we're doing the best we can. We have those 5 seconds. It's very much, I recommend Lights and Sirens to people who are starting P school, because it is very much that inner, like you get in the mind of somebody who's in the heat of it. Because even us talking, even sitting in a room full of paramedics and instructors, you can talk all day long about, oh, here's advice, here's this, that, and the other. But when you're in the cusp of it, it's like that calm before a storm feeling of like, okay, this is what I can look for. This is what I can expect. This is what could happen. This is how I can mitigate these situations, and this beautiful stuff. But in your journey, you went from, like you talked about, IFT, whatnot, which has its place. Sometimes it's not that bad anyways, to wild rescues and working in the national park. I want to first dive into, how did you get in with working in a national park? Like, do I go to a website? How do I do that? And what does it mean? Because like you imagine the park rangers and like the guys with the hats and all that stuff, but what is it in reality for somebody that's working as a paramedic or an EMT, however that works? in the national park? What is that like?
Well, it's definitely challenging. How you get into that is there's a website called usajobs.gov. And so they will post it. A lot of them have seasonal summer paramedics because and summer EMTs because the summer is when like millions of people are there. Winter kind of slows down. So there's summer seasonal. There's now term positions, so it's like a couple years, and then I think they're starting to hire full-time paramedics at like Yosemite, Grand Canyon. So it's evolving to be more of a full-time thing. So I'd say just check USA Jobs probably weekly if you're really interested in it, and then just formatting your resume exactly how they ask, because the computer sort of screens it initially, and if you don't like put in how many hours a week you work and was it full time, just all that kind of stuff. But so once you get hired, you go out to your national park, and I was summer seasonal, and then I'd say like the people that do the best in national parks are just people that love the outdoors, because that's where you're living and those are the patients you'll be treating. And so a great foundation is just to be a great provider. So I would rather, a great provider from a city, urban area can be a great provider in the national parks because they have that strong assessment and treatment skill set. But when you get to the national parks, you got to just start thinking differently, because at Yellowstone, we had a small like clinic at Old Faithful, but the closest hospital was, I think, an hour and a half. The closest level 2 trauma center was about 3 hours. The closest level 1 was in Salt Lake. That's about 5 hours. So obviously you got to think, where do they need to go? How do they get there? By ground? Can we call in a helicopter? Is the weather even going to allow the helicopter? So the environment's always affecting your patient. Could be hypothermia, it could be heat illness, like we were talking about earlier, or it could be, hey, we can't land a helicopter. It's snowing, Or actually at Old Faithful, we can't land the helicopter because there's a bison on the helipad. Just crazy things like that. So that's the fun part. It's always dynamic. And then just, very limited resources. In the city, I was showing up with 4 on the engine, 2 on the ambulance every call. Whereas in the national park, sometimes it's just me on the ambulance and I'm meeting law enforcement park rangers on scene. So you really learn to be like very specific of what needs to get done now and how should I triage my care based on the patient's presentation. So that's kind of a quick intro, because most people want to know, how do I get into it? Will I be successful? And then ultimately, I want folks to be happy. So I think, we've had paramedics in like Grand Teton who you have 2 to 3 days off a week, and every time they have days off, they're leaving the park. Those type of people typically don't love it because, they're leaving the national park on their days off. But the people who tend to love these positions are people who, hey, I want to stay in Grand Teton and fish on my days off, or I want to go backpacking. That type of person typically does the best. And you don't have to be an expert hiker, backpacker. You just have to love being out there.
Absolutely. And I mean, it's easy to be like, oh, well, that will be a given. But also, I mean, when you're doing that 24/7 and you're surrounded by it, like we talked about, I like outside when I'm inside looking at it from a window, or
Sure.
I'm in the AC. Growing up in Louisiana and then moving back has absolutely ruined me, because going away from humidity back to it, miserable.
Yeah, I could see that.
I like colder weather, but I don't know, even just like the idea of like you wake up there, you work there, all that, you have 2 to 3 days off a week. I can't promise I'm not gonna apply for it because I'm not made for it. I know me. I would be one of those people. But also, shoot, where was I going with that? Shoot. Rip. Never mind.
It's early in the day.
Still trying to finish my coffee. I woke up too late. But no, I have mad respect for any provider that, even not just EMS, but just anybody that's going to work in the national park, because it's a lot of people. And like you talked about those scarce resources, they're, from what I read, from what you wrote, they're limited, and you have to have all of these other factors going on. Like whenever I show up to a call, I'm wondering all the way there, do we need to fly this patient? Or I don't know, we're like 30, 40 minutes from a trauma center. I think we'll be fine. Not, we're 3 or 4 hours. And
Sure.
then if there's no flight, that is you managing that patient the whole way. Hooey, boys. That's a lot.
Yeah.
No pressure.
It was stressful, but it was, a great learning curve for me. So I feel like it really gave me like wings as a paramedic, just coming out of school, doing the IFT. And I wasn't harshing on the IFT. I was actually like, I'm proud to say I did it, because I think whenever I see like IFT folks in the hospital, I always like say hello, shake their hand. Cause I remember like the paramedics with like LAFD who did that to me. And it just gave me like so much hope, and then I've also had friends who like have stayed in the IFT world and promoted. So, but after doing that, then going to Yellowstone, it was a learning curve when suddenly I'm like alone in the back of the ambulance by myself.
There is, on this podcast, there's never hate against IFT. Everywhere I've worked thus far has been private, so it's a good mix of both. And like I've said so many times, and I'll say it again, it is so nice, like yesterday, when you're getting slammed back to back and then you're dropped with that transfer. Like, thank you. Everything's already done. Fingers crossed, I'm not going to have to even do anything. I can just write my report. I can take a breath.
Sure.
I can talk about my dogs to this patient. Like, thank you.
Yeah, good point.
But it is, and I've been in those situations where, depending on where you work, I was in a very, very, very rural setting. We had done transfers for like, I think like 3 shifts straight. And then we got dropped with a critical call. And I remember like showing up and I'm like, oh, I need a second. Hold on. Wait.
Sure.
So it's a different beast when it's just you and you're surrounded by the national park. And oh man, it very much, like you said, it's a kind of make it or break it moment of like, okay, you have all these skills, you are told what to do when, but like, it's all you. It is all you.
Yeah, I think this week has been a good representation of working in national parks, and it's probably the last 2 weeks, but there was a guy who fell off his kayak and he's still missing. There was a woman who drove into the river and she was deceased. There was my guy took an axe to the lower leg. There was a shooting at Yellowstone in the Canyon District. So it's just, there's a couple like UTV rollovers and, someone falling off a horse. So it's just very diverse. But ultimately, my new thing, which I tell myself is, because people hear the mechanism and they get all stressed, so like I wasn't on that shooting, but if you think about a gunshot wound, lately I just think of it like, okay, they've got a hole that needs to be plugged. You know what I mean? Instead of like, say you respond to a shark attack, just think of it like they have some lacerations, it kind of just like calms you down a little bit more.
That's fair.
So that's what I'm doing out here. Like, there was 5 bison gorings my last summer in Yellowstone, and just thinking of it like, okay, there's probably some puncture wounds. And so that just calms you down a little bit more. Cause when you say just, a bear attack, your mind will just get ramping up. So instead of you just think of it as just the injuries. So probably some lacerations, some puncture wounds, maybe some trauma. I don't know. That kind of helps calm me down from thinking of this crazy wild grizzly attack.
That would be really helpful, because if I heard, especially with bears now, if I heard bear attack, y'all have to actually go to that. If I heard bear attack, I'd be like, all right, well, we'll sit until the bear's, I guess, gone. I don't know what do we do? Y'all just go. kudos to that, because I also don't like blood, guts, and gore. How I've lasted this long is beyond me. Um, but like
Sure.
y'all do all of that. You also have to think about like y'all, especially like these, not necessarily like helicopter search and rescues because you just land, but like you talked about in the book, actually going to these patients. When I lived in Utah, we had to hike. Oh God, it may not have been a full mile. I was not used to the altitude yet, and I wasn't used to that dry heat. And we
Sure.
had all of our equipment because all we got was this 20-something-year-old fell over his bike and was unconscious at the bottom of a hill, but we couldn't drive anything to. And then the helicopter wouldn't land in that area because of where he was hiking at. Hiking with all of that gear on top of the heat in this desert was, by the time we got to the patient, I was out of breath. And I also
Sure.
like, I'm going to be very transparent. There was a solid 2 minutes where I could not think because I'm like, now we got to get the ATV out here. Now we got to get this patient loaded up. Oh, his legs shouldn't be bending that way. How are we going to do that? And now like I said, kudos, mad respect for anybody that can do national park. I cannot, because I like just the next call. We showed up to Meemaw's house and she's already in her wheelchair and we just got to wheel her out. I like that.
Sure. Yeah.
I don't like sweating.
Right. Well, it's good. I think everyone has their own preference. And, I encourage people to go where they want to be. And, for instance, like I like wildland fire, but I'm not super passionate about it. Whereas other folks at our agency, they love it. So when we have a wildland fire, I'm like, hey, yeah, you guys take it and I'll hang back and cover in town so you can go. So I'm all about wherever your interest is, just go there, And I happen to be a firefighter and I love fire, but my main interest is the medical side of things. So within my agency, I've, handled doing the med supply ordering and a lot of training. So I think we all have strengths, and just to kind of balance out the team, it's what it's all about.
Absolutely. And key point on team and not the individual person. I do want to ask you, you gave a lot of stories in your book. What is one of those calls at a national park, whether you wrote about it or not? What's one that has stuck with you, whether it's because you had to trek through, I don't know, valleys and climb trees, or like what is something that when you think back to working at the national parks and all the things that you did, what's something that sticks with you?
Yeah, I think, with both Lights and Sirens and Wild Rescues, I really wanted to like vary the call types I talk about, because if I just give trauma after trauma after trauma, it gets kind of boring. So I wanted to do maybe a traumatic call, and even like the shows like 911 and Chicago Fire, there's the traumatic call, then there's kind of like the humorous call from one reason or another, then there's the bad medical call, then there's the psych. So I kind of wanted to like have the full palette of colors. But I guess two calls in the national parks is one, which starts the book, is that guy at Yosemite who was hiking towards Yosemite Falls, fell, hit his head, then went into cardiac arrest. That sticks with me just because the access issues. We had to kind of hike up this boulder field to get to him. And then, with the wilderness medicine, it just seems like there's always these reversals. So we get there and then he's kind of wedged between the rocks. And my medical director, Dr. Will Smith, he talks about the ideal to real care. So the ideal, like you train on the ideal, but the real is just like he's wedged between the rocks. We got to get him out, so as safely as we can. But then he went into cardiac arrest and then he got a pulse, just the back and forth reversals, and then similarly in Yellowstone, this woman who like drove off this embankment and we couldn't, she weighed quite a bit, so we couldn't carry her up. So then we got a winch and attached it to the top of the backboard. So that pulled her up and we just held her up. And then we landed a helicopter. Everything was going to go great. And then the weight limit was exceeded because it's midsummer and it's hot. And so just like when I think of wilderness medicine, I think of just all the reversals, you land the helicopter and then it can't lift off scene because of the weather, or there's a bison on the landing pad, or you know what I mean? It just seems like it's really amplified out there because there's so many elements and factors to each call.
No, absolutely. And that's perfect. The ideal versus the real, because even in just like your general training situations and getting ACLS and PALS and PHTLS and going through school and continual like training sessions and field educational opportunities, all of the things, it's always these, unless you have a really good training center, it's always these perfectly laid out situations where you go in, the patient has chest pain. Oh, what do? You run a 12 lead. Oh, it's this. You give the nitro. Oh, they feel better. Yay.
Sure.
Not factoring in all of the other things of, yeah, there's like the son in the room next over. He's our frequent flyer site patient. So like you have to mitigate him, who you don't know what he has in his pockets, who's behind you, and hopefully the officers are there. On top of also like all of these other things that like if it can go wrong, oh, it absolutely will.
Sure. Yeah, I know. It's like my last patient in VTAC, it's like you're in VTAC, he's barely conscious. All right, sir, we want to do this. We want to give you this medication or cardiovert you, take you to the hospital. I'm not going anywhere. Like it's just funny that it's never the way it is in school. And I think as a trainer, as I'm talking about this, I should put more reversals into my training, just situations like that,
Exactly. Because even as you can train all day long, but until it's the actual in the situation moment, very much same mindset of when you come to that situation, when you come to that roadblock, obstacle, how are you going to overcome it? How are you going to work through that? How are you going to mitigate it? How do you work with the tools that you have? I don't know. I had a trauma patient who, for whatever reason that we don't carry pelvic binders, and I'm not about to get on this soapbox. We didn't have a pelvic binder. He got hit by a car doing estimated 60 something. We don't know. They never stopped. My man's was found like face down in a ditch. He's barely conscious. Go to like, not rock the pelvis, but kind of just like, where are we at? And it's squishy. I don't have a pelvic binder. Flight is still 10 minutes out. Right. What do I do? Yeah. I got one of our little like stretcher sheet things that we just put nice over our patients, and I just tied it around them and flight opened the doors, and they looked and they were like, what? And I said, I don't have a pelvic binder. They're like, okay. Then I finally got a blood pressure of 80 something systolic, and I said, oh, ew. Anyways,
right. Yeah, one last thing just to
what you got
is with wilderness medicine or any kind of medicine, always be thinking of what you're going to do when what you're doing fails. So like, oh, I want to start an IV, but already be thinking that IO. So then when you can't get that IV, you're not freaking out. And the same with like search and rescue. It's like, okay, Yosemite did this well. We're launching a helicopter to the patient, but they had a rescue team going up the trail. So when the helicopter, if it couldn't land, we already had a second option already moving forward to the patient. So always have, I think it's the Navy SEALs, that idea of like 2 is 1 and 1 is none. So whether it's just always be thinking of that second option.
Absolutely. And you can plan as much as you want, you can train as much as you want, and you can educate yourself as much as you want. And you should always strive to learn more, do better, be better. However, and this is just from us field workers, not in the national parks, but anything can happen. I personally have never been able to not fly a patient because there are animals on the helipad, but I don't know. We have ducks at our hospitals that we're not allowed to even honk at. So it could happen.
Right. Sure.
Running ducks off. But there was something else. Oh, do you have one national park that you like over another? I don't know if you're allowed to say that, if you have to sign an NDA of not picking favorites.
I guess, Yellowstone has a place in my heart because it was the first park I worked for the National Park Service. Grand Teton, I think, is probably one of my favorites, just because you got mountains, you got rivers you can recreate on. You can raft them, float them. Lots of wildlife, bison, grizzly bears, wolves. And then I do like a lot of those parks in the Pacific Northwest, like Olympic, North Cascades, Mount Rainier. And then Zion's up there too. So lots of great choices. And Acadia back out in Maine. So how about you? You got a favorite one?
I haven't been to one in a hot minute. I remember the Grand Canyon. It was very hot. So
Sure.
we went in the cusp of summer. I had broken my foot. Then I fell off the top bunk in our RV camper trailer and I broke my wrist. So the whole time
Wow.
I had like that nasty boot on and a wrist brace on. It was
You're like a
beautiful.
multi-system trauma, It's cool you still went though,
Oh, absolutely. I may not like to sweat. I may not like to be hot, but if there's going to be outdoors, and especially nobody's going to call me a wimp and nobody's going to tell me that I can't do something. So absolutely, I still went. It was
Nice.
very hot, but it was beautiful. Highly recommend.
Yeah,
But
that's awesome.
oh, okay. Last one. As far as like when y'all do search and rescue, and even like in the book, you talked about, y'all being in the ambulance and you talk about running these calls and doing stuff like that. Depending on the agency that you work at on the ground as well, everybody knows there's different protocols, there's different medical directors, there's different interventions you can versus can't do, that kind of thing. Was there, and this is just me asking, I would be worried if I opened the med bag that maybe some of the things aren't there because I don't know, you may not use it, or I'm going to go reach for something. And I'm like, oh shoot, we don't have that because we never use it. So we never order it. Like, was there ever anything like that? Because when I do inventory, Solumedrol is my favorite medication. Hardly ever get to give it. I like pushing the little thing and shaking it up and then drawing it up. That's
Nice.
pretty much the only reason. But I feel like y'all may not have to carry Solumedrol. What does that look like for y'all? Like, what y'all do for that?
Actually, we carry a lot more meds in the kind of wilderness setting, just because the transport times are a lot longer. So we do have Solumedrol, and like even at Yellowstone, we had like antibiotics like Ancef. Dr. Will Smith and AJ Wheeler, Dr. AJ Wheeler, they're very progressive here in Jackson Hole. So we had, ketamine years ago and TXA. And so we actually carry a lot more, but we do, frequent equipment outdates and equipment checks, so that kind of makes sure everything's where we need it. And that's the fun thing about working remotely is you get to use your whole treatment protocol because you're with the patient a lot longer. In a city, you might have time just start an IV, whereas on that allergic reaction, like you mentioned, we could do epi, Benadryl, Solumedrol, maybe even a breathing treatment. So that's the fun part of working out here.
That's fair. All right, that makes sense. And I don't want you to think I was trying to imply that y'all don't carry things. Not like that.
Oh, no.
I was just wondering.
Some folks might not know.
Yeah.
But yeah, we tend to carry more just because the hospital is so far away. And actually, I forgot to mention it, but we now have ultrasound on the ambulance in Jackson Hole. And, just because we want to see, hey, is there bleeding in the abdomen? We're an hour from the closest hospital. So maybe we want to launch that helicopter. And then I had this guy who fell a couple weeks ago and, everyone breath sounds. Do we hear him? Do we not? Now we have the ultrasound and we can look for that lung sliding. Like, oh, there's no lung. In this case, there was lung sliding, so he doesn't need a needle decompression. So that's another cool thing that we have, and we'll probably get blood products down the road at some point because that seems to be the trend. So yeah, it's really exciting place to work.
I know there's a lot of people who are like back and forth and you're either one side or the other of ultrasound and whatnot. I personally am a huge fan. I have come to very little situations where I thought to myself, like, I wish I could see. However, like you talked about, when y'all are in those very hairy situations of are we going to fly or not, and like talk about ultrasounding the lungs, ultrasounding the abdomen, ultrasound. It is extra education. It is extra training. It's a cost, but I think it would be very beneficial, even if it's just the one patient that it helps. It's worth it. That's just me. Anyways.
Yeah, because I was all set to needle decompress this guy, and then it revealed, hey, he didn't need it, And another one is I had a really bad skier, and even just the small things you don't think about. And his leg was totally mangled, and I wasn't sure if I could feel a pulse. You can just stick the ultrasound down to that pedal pulse and find it. So there's lots of different capabilities, and we're still learning. We're a little slower, but we'll speed up in time.
Everything takes time, and with every agency, it does. I've always had the notion that it doesn't matter if everybody else is adopting a Lucas device, but you just got it. You're gonna, because you work at a different agency than everybody else, and you run not different calls, but you have different settings. You have different people that you run with. Once you adopt a new thing, you start ground level zero for you and your people that you run with. That's how I look at it. It doesn't matter.
Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah. So, I think that's all I had, my guy. Do you have anything that you want to tell people? Anything that you'd want people to know? Something to consider?
No, I think I'd say consider me a resource, and if people have questions, check out my website, just kevingrange.com. Feel free to email me questions if you have questions about working for the National Park Service or anything else. I reply to every email. So I'm a resource. And if you come through the Jackson Hole area, swing by the fire station and say hello. I'll give you a badge and a tour, and, it's fun to meet folks that may have read my book. It's awesome. So I'm very appreciative.
I want to end on one last final thing.
Sure.
If there was a perfect world where you got to choose, even if it doesn't exist, but we're going to hypothetically go through this. Would you rather work national park, or would you rather do the firefighter paramedic life? What would you rather? If you can't answer it, it's fine.
It's hard to say, but what I tell people is I bleed the green and gray of the National Park Service. But I also love working for Jackson Hole Fire EMS, So I have the best of both worlds here because we work a bunch with Grand Teton. So I'd say either full-time at Grand Teton or full-time at Jackson Hole Fire is kind of where I'm happiest.
Okay. That's
fine. So sweet.
Okay, that's all I have. That's all I got. Thank you for coming on, man. Again, if you have not read Lights and Sirens, if you have not read Wild Rescues, and soon Fears, if you haven't read any of that, go check it out. Mr. Kevin Grange. I'm not just saying this because you're here. I'd say it if you weren't here. Just the writing style, from a former English major, somebody that, it's very hard to write well. Let's just be very honest, in a way that you can reach several different types of readers, and getting these messages across while also conveying different stories and your own thoughts and processes. It's hard to get that across in a way that can resonate with so many people. And I 100% believe that you've done that. Lights and Sirens was good. Go read Wild Rescues. It is a roller coaster of multiple adventures. And like Kevin talked about, it's not just the gory, ooey gooey trauma and all that kind of stuff, and drama with the traumas. There's also some really good medical calls, and I'm just going to leave my favorite one probably is the lady on the ice skating rink, and I'm just going to leave it at that.
Sure.
That really good one. But Mr. Kevin, if that's all you got, that's all I got. I appreciate you coming on. Appreciate your wisdom, your experience in a national park. I think that's super cool. But if that's all you got, that's all I got. Yeah. And as I end every single episode, so with that.
The 22 at the Lips podcast is designed to support, not replace, the relationship that exists between a practitioner and his or her medical director. The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the host, guest, and not necessarily of Master Medics. The information provided during this podcast is intended for educational and informational purposes only. It is not a substitute for your approved protocols.